Who sets the premiums? That's a good question. I think it's the FDIC who sets the, I mean, I'm sure it's the FDIC who sets the premiums, but I don't know what criteria they use to set it.
Do other countries insure?
Yes, that's another good question. I think we were the maverick in deposit insurance, and when we started deposit insurance, a handful of countries caught on. And then nobody really liked deposit insurance, and then over the years there's been a lot more crises, so more and more countries have started deposit insurance, and they will model their system after ours. But in a really corrupt economy, deposit insurance does more bad than it does good, according to this book, and hopefully we'll get to that.
FDIC wanted to choose how much more the banks pay each premium. They're around about 20 cents. They wanted to do it around much more 40 cents.
Okay.
And they were asking for the Senate committee whether or not that was possible or feasible.
And what was the final verdict? I think they've raised premiums a handful of times.
Yeah, they didn't say. I mean, they didn't go on to say it. Greenspan was there, the FDIC chairman was there, and then the chairman of the Comptroller of the Treasury was also there with Clark. I think at the time going on, he was also saying as far as the FDIC, how much sponsor.
I know Greenspan probably wouldn't be in favor of raising premiums.
Well, no, I think it was pretty much like the outcast. They were asking also because FDIC can also borrow money from the federal finance banks also. And that's what they said too as far as the videos watching the Senate committee was. They only have a certain amount of that BIF fund.
I think that they call it the DIF fund.
Big bank insurance fund. I think before that.
Oh, okay.
Something like that.
Oh, that makes sense, because there was something, there's a savings insurance fund or something like that, so that makes sense. Now they just have a deposit insurance fund.
Yeah. And what they said they didn't have enough money inside this fund, so they were thinking about them borrowing from the federal finance bank.
I've actually never heard the name Federal Finance Bank. I'm interested. I have to do more research now. I know that they've gotten loans from Treasury a handful of times to finance.
The Treasury.
Okay. I've not. No, you know.
It was pretty interesting.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Anytime anyone can add a little flavor to my class, it's all good. Most things are. Which my lectures can be on YouTube too, maybe.
Yeah, they're live broadcast.
Do doctors still make subscribers?
I don't think they get very many likes.
Just make them bang.
But yeah, so purchase and assumption agreement is the favored way to close a bank. Because in a purchase and assumption agreement, basically what happens is when banks are failing, the writing's on the wall for a long time. You can see the operations deteriorate, you can see the asset portfolios just shriveling and things going bankrupt. It's pretty bloody. And so this whole time, you can see the capital ratios dipping. This whole time, the FDIC is asking the bank to try to find someone to buy it out. And the bank's trying, or it's not trying. There's nothing they can do to really force their hand. But if it gets to a critical point, then the FDIC steps in, and it starts marketing the bank to a potential buyer. And if it successfully does so, then it comes in and closes the institution under a purchase and assumption method, I guess. Yeah. Also called an assisted transaction, we called it. But basically when the FDIC comes in and finds a potential buyer for that bank. Now, think about, if you're a bank, under what circumstances do you want to buy a bank that is failing? There's a bank that proved that it cannot run its operations profitably. In fact, it's incurring losses consistently.
You get all their depositors.
You get all their depositors, yeah, that's a benefit. And so that's liabilities, and that's important to consider. But what about their assets? Why would you ever want to buy the assets of a bank whose assets are bad enough to fail?
And if you have enough money, it's kind of like.
Yes, there's
You know,
exactly.
yeah.
It's not if you have enough money, if you buy it for cheap enough.
Yeah.
Yep. So if you get a good enough deal on it, then you'll go through with the transaction. And the way the FDIC sort of gives potential buyers a good enough deal is they'll do it through a loss share agreement. They will basically sequester all the toxic assets, the assets that are causing the bank to go bankrupt, and they'll say, all right, potential buyer, we'll hold on to these bad assets, you can just buy the good assets. And so that's a way that the FDIC keeps the institution viable, keeps the failing bank alive, so that it doesn't have to pay out to all the depositors.
What is the agreement called?
Purchase and assumption agreement, I guess?
No, the other one.
Loss share, oh yeah, sorry, loss share agreement, yep. And it's basically sharing in the losses of the, this is one way the FDIC can do a loss share. Another way is by saying, look, you buy all the assets, and if, we will pay for the first 5% of losses. So if you have losses on some of these assets, we'll cover them. You don't have to let those losses eat into your capital. That's another loss share agreement.
Is there any person from that part that you have a funder come in and buy the bank?
No, that's not the case. Well, so in order to be in the business of banking, as we'll get into later, you have to pass a stringent background check. This is one of the role of regulators, is to make sure that a person running a bank is financially savvy enough to be running a bank, because the possible consequences of his actions or inactions could affect an entire community. So the FDIC and other regulatory agencies in the state do a lot of due diligence to make sure that the person who is buying the bank isn't just any guy buying the bank. And that's the case if you want to step in and, buy equity of the bank if the bank is failing, or that's the case if you want to start a bank. The regulators are sitting around doing a lot of due diligence to make sure you have enough capital to go through with it, to make sure you're not just saying, hey, I want to start a bank, I got a couple $100, that's going to be fine, right? And to make sure that you are wise enough and have a good enough track record at managing things well, so as not to cause more harm than you do good.
And so another bank, you buy another bank out?
Yes, realistically speaking, this is what happens. I want to say 100% of the time.
What about if it's a whole, what about that?
Same thing. I mean, and generally it's, I don't want to speak here. I don't think it's going to be a bank. Most banks, almost all, not almost, 60+% of banks are structured as holding companies right now. And all the banks that are in a position to buy out another bank are definitely structured as holding companies. So it's going to be a holding company that buys that bank. And that buys them some time for integrating the systems too, because if it's another bank buying another bank, you have to sort of merge the books immediately, but that might not be accountingly convenient for you at the time. So yeah, so it's going to be other banks that buy this bank. Okay, so that's the best case scenario, purchase and assumption agreements. The worst case scenario, or the other scenario, is basically a payout. And in this case, the FDIC comes in, puts a closed sign on the bank, takes the keys from the banker, opens up Monday morning, this happens on Fridays, opens up Monday morning, there's long lines of people, they issue a press release Friday night, long lines of people waiting out, and the FDIC has tons of people in there writing checks. All right, your deposit account was $163,047, here's a check for that much. That happens the very next day, or these checks are cut.
That's only up to the point we're insured, correct?
Yes, exactly. And so what happens to the money that's not insured? Well, close, but it's not a total loss. What happens is the FDIC basically becomes another creditor. So after the FDIC pays out all of the $250,000 or less that each depositor has, the FDIC joins all the other creditors in a bankruptcy court, and they have a neutral judge, arbiter, that basically hashes out who gets what and how much they get. The book gives us an estimate that historically, deposits over the insurance threshold have been able to get 90 cents on the dollar back, which seems remarkably high to me. But Michigan, or whatever his name, is much smarter than me. So I didn't have time to find you guys a better estimate, so we'll go with that one for now. Elizabeth?
Since the FDIC only insures up to $250,000, is that kind of why you want to keep like different accounts in different banks and not like all
Yeah,
your
so
money? Is that kind of the reason?
yeah, that's one really good reason to do that. It's much safer that way. You don't have to worry about taking losses. I mean, realistically speaking, if you're a millionaire, you're probably not going to want to hold too much money in super liquid assets like bank accounts in the first place. You're going to have sort of investment strategies and tax avoidance strategies and stuff. But in general, a lot of millionaires, a lot of the old grandmas that have been able to save up their life savings, just hold tons of money at banks. And I can't say that they all hold their money at separate banks, but I can say it would be much smarter if they did. So yeah, from a consumer standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay, so what we covered is the first and arguably one of the most important ways that the government interacts with the banking system is through deposit insurance. And now when the book describes it, they clump deposit insurance under an umbrella that says something like government protection or something like that. On the first page in chapter 18 here. Probably come prepared, but they call it government safety net. So deposit insurance is one element of the government safety net. The other element that they talk about that we'll get to momentarily is government safety net. The other element is sort of too big to fail. And other bailouts. The word too big to fail, the phrase too big to fail, comes from a would-be failure in the 80s. I think it was 84. A bank in Illinois was going to fail, but it was going to be the biggest failure at the time. And so the FDIC said, well, wait a second, we really don't want this to happen. If this failure happens, then we're going to have to pay out a ton of money, and this is going to have significant impact on the economy. So what we're going to do instead, we're going to give depositors a stronger incentive not to withdraw their money. And we're going to do that by insuring deposits over the $100,000 insurance threshold at the time. So that happened. I'm not sure if the bank actually failed or not, but the precedent was set that if you are a big and important enough bank, then the government will take more drastic measures to catch you in their safety net, to make sure you don't fail. And so the phrase too big to fail came up. And it was later noted in some kind of Senate committee that not only was this Illinois bank too big to fail, but in fact 11 banks at the time, the regulators said they would not let fail. We would take more drastic measures to avoid failure of 11 banks. So it became known that all you had to do to avoid failure was grow to be too big to fail. We're going to talk about what sort of problems that brings. So let me erase some stuff here. Crystal, you have these questions written down by any chance?
No. Am I supposed to?
Did you write them down so that I can erase it? And then,
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I guess we'll start with, so I have been pitching to you why deposit insurance is a good thing and why the government safety net is a good thing. But there's also a very dark side of government intervention, which libertarians will flaunt. And while we left off on too big to fail, we might as well pick up on it. The argument goes that a big bank failing, and also big banks, by the way, are called money center banks. So a money center bank, there'll be counterparties, and as we talked about last class, there will be contagion in the financial system. And this was in fact the case when AIG failed, this was the case when Lehman Brothers failed, this was the case when Bear Stearns failed, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of bad things have failed. So regulators have an extra incentive not to let big banks fail, closing these big banks, to avoid closing these big banks. And so these are the banks that the government would close last. They take every possible measure to not close that bank. And as such, these banks get an implicit subsidy. It's cheaper for these banks to borrow money because nobody realistically believes that they're going to fail. And there's no depositors sort of micromanaging their books and making sure that they're acting soundly because nobody believes they're going to fail. So these banks have an incentive to take more risk. Okay? That's one of the problems with too big to fail, is that there's less repercussions for taking risk, so they're going to do more of too big to fail, is that it encourages consolidation. Can somebody explain to me why the presence of too big to fail encourages consolidation. Why the notion that a bank couldn't be closed because of the horrible consequences that it have on the economy encourages banks to merge together. Pardon?
They wanna get big.
That's it, right? Not
Gains.
exactly. I didn't hear that. What'd you say?
Gains.
Gains? It's a fair answer in finance. Yeah, so if all you have to do to not be closed and to be able to take on more risk, because as you guys as finance majors understand, more risk comes with more reward. If all you have to do is become too big to fail, let's become too big. And so this encourages the consolidation. Because how do you become too big? You can do it the hard way of stealing customers from neighboring banks and offering better rates and better service. Both of those things come with cost disadvantages. Or you can do it the easy way of buying your neighbor. We'll make you an offer you can't refuse. And you basically grow by acquiring more institutions. And this is very difficult to test empirically, but theoretically, you could trace the consolidation in the banking industry, at least partially, to this too big to fail notion. Because it creates an incentive for banks to consolidate. Make sense? No
Are they
one's
like trying to become a monopoly?
It would be very difficult to become a monopoly in the financial sector just because this is such a heavily regulated sector, and this is probably one of the healthiest competitions there are, like for national banks and they're like really big banks. But within a community, they can consolidate to try to become a monopoly. That makes sense. Yeah.
How does a bank know that they're at the point of too big to fail?
There's no hard threshold. There
So
is are part of the the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act was the establishment of SIFIs, systemically important financial institutions, and these were the 30 plus financial institutions. I guess it started out as 20, but now it's over 30. Not just banks. I think MetLife is in there. A few others are in there. A few non-commercial banks, investment banks like Goldman Sachs, had to become SIFIs, but for different reasons and stuff. But anyway, so it's pretty safe to assume that if you're a SIFI, you're too big to fail. But that doesn't mean that it's guaranteed, and it also doesn't mean that if you're not a SIFI, you're not too big to fail. It's a pretty difficult subjective threshold to understand. Good question.
What exactly does it mean when banks consolidate?
They merge. Sorry, yeah. So we either one bank buys another, or the two banks say, "Hey, let's team up, and we can market this a little bit." So,
Maybe I missed it when you mentioned it, but what's a SIFI mean?
a systemically important financial institution. I won't write it down now. I'll write it down later. We'll get to that word.
You can erase that.
What's that?
You can erase
Oh,
that.
cool. Thanks. So let's formalize the reasons why deposit insurance might be bad. We talked about too big to fail a little bit, but that's more a government safety net thing in general, not just deposit insurance specifically. Let's think about deposit insurance specifically. And while we're on specifics, I'm going to name names here. We have Elizabeth, Jaling, Taylor, Mario, Jackson, and Ruben. You guys all answered a question correctly on the test that would help you answer this question. So, why might deposit insurance be bad? And I alluded to the reason for it a little earlier, but think about it. What are the disadvantages to deposit insurance? And the answer is going to have something to do with incentives. Moral hazard.
I didn't get it right, apparently.
Your name wasn't on that list, but
Sorry.
go ahead. No, elaborate. What? Sorry, I'm kidding. What does moral hazard? How does moral hazard relate to banking?
Well,
To deposit insurance?
I don't know, I was thinking about it in relation to too big to fail though, like it gives the management more incentive to take risks because they know that, I don't know how to explain it, but
You're on something. Anyone want to help him out? Taylor?
Because knowing you have the insurance against that, you're more likely to take risks
Yeah.
because you already have the tax advantage.
Exactly. So, what happens if you take the risk? You don't lose. The deposit insurer loses, right? You have a lower expected cost or we call it a marginal cost of your risk than in the absence of deposit insurance. Okay? So another way of thinking about the chain of events here is that generally creditors are responsible or have the most at stake if an institution fails. So, or goes bankrupt. So creditors are usually the ones doing the due diligence and making sure that these institutions, these firms, these banks, whatever we're talking about here, are financially healthy and sound. And so the primary, most important creditors in a bank are depositors. Did you have a question, Ruben?
Yeah, are there companies that like add depositing or like insurance to make it like 300,000 to 250,000?
Are there supplementary deposit insurance?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. My gut instinct is that they do exist. I can tell you anecdotally, the state of Massachusetts insures all deposits, regardless of the federal deposit insurance limit. So that might come in handy for you Bank of New Englanders, but it might not. I don't know. I haven't looked it up. I don't know when that policy started. But yeah, so I would expect that to be the case. I would expect that to be something that you consider, but I'm not sure. I'll find out for you. That's a good question. Yeah, so the most important creditors, when we talked about the creditors do most of the due diligence and the monitoring, well, the most important creditors for banks are depositors. So generally, depositors would be, because fundamentally, what's a creditor? Just someone who lends somebody money. Depositors lend banks money. And if there were no deposit insurance, then depositors would be much more wary about lending banks money. Even people with $20,000, which happens to be their entire life savings, wouldn't go and just give it away willy-nilly, and they'd monitor the bank carefully. But as it happens, because of deposit insurance, those creditors, those depositors, lose their incentive to monitor the bank. If they don't have as big an incentive to monitor the bank, bankers have a bigger incentive to take risk. Because there's less people looking out are these risks that they're taking sound? Are they good? Are they bad? There's less watchdogs there. So risk comes with reward. So if they take more risks, they could probably get higher bonuses. So bankers have an incentive to take more risk. And that's basically moral hazard. We have undesirable actions, and it comes from deposit insurance. There's an argument in the book for asymmetric information as well, or for adverse selection, how deposit insurance also creates an adverse selection problem. My personal opinion is that argument is a little more tenuous than this one, a little more difficult to grasp, but I will repeat it for you anyway. So, taking as a starting point that bankers can get away with more risk, who is going to want to be bankers?
Risky people.
Risky people, yep. So, natural risk seekers. I guess that would be the case if there would not be a very strict monitoring system on who regulators let into banking in the first place. But maybe this is before we consider that. And so if it is the case that more risky people are going to become bankers, well, that turns out to be the people who the deposit insurer wants to insure the least. Those are going to be the people with the highest expected cost for the deposit insurer. The people who the deposit insurer wants to get into banking are, the risk-averse old grandmas, provided they have some finance savvy. But yeah, so there again, we demonstrated adverse selection. The people who self-select into banking are adverse from the perspective of the deposit insurer. Those are the people who we want to be in banking the least. I'm not sure if you buy that, I don't, but the book does. Okay. We mentioned consolidation a few minutes ago. Now, can somebody give me an argument why consolidation is a good thing? This would be the easier argument. Maybe someone who we haven't heard from as much. Why is it, from what perspective is it good that banks consolidate? Audrey?
Because then there wouldn't be as much competition in the other banks around.
Okay, so who's that good for?
Pull it out of the hat.
It'd be better for banks because they have less competition, so they would be able to set their prices to what they want.
Okay, that sounds like the monopoly argument that Elizabeth was getting at. So yeah, that makes sense. It's, I guess what you're saying is that it's easier for a bank to stay in business if there's less competitive pressure. Is that right?
Yeah.
So that's very true, and that's one positive from the perspective of the bank. The counterweight to that would be it's a negative from the perspective of the consumer. The consumer has less market power now. But another reason why it might be good that banks are consolidating is because it creates a more efficient bank. If you believe in economies of scale, which there's strong arguments for in banking, you would probably believe that there's a lot of costs that can be cut by, a lot of fixed costs primarily that can be cut by consolidating. Let's say two banks decide to merge. Each of them have CEOs. Now there's only one bank. Now you only have to have one CEO. Chances are he's not going to make twice as much as one bank CEO made. He's probably going to make a little less. So that's the sort of realization of an actual cost savings by merging, right? So from that perspective, if banks become more efficient, they can afford to charge you less for your loans, right? They can give you, the consumer, a better deal. That's one argument. It makes sense. In other industries, that's the case. We want companies to be efficient. Generally, everyone's, it's socially optimal if companies are efficient.
But then also if they consolidate, that kind of makes, like doubles.
Customer service. Everybody bitches about them. They're horrible in how they treat their consumers. I don't know if you guys have. What's that?
I do.
Bank of America,
Too big.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sure if you're not a picky customer, then I'm sure there are some people that they haven't screwed over. So that's, statistically speaking, there's got to be a few.
I just feel like the way that, I've always had fine, customer service with tellers, but I feel like sometimes tellers aren't, they kind of get rude and seem like they're, really annoyed with everyone.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's a big issue if you have double the amount of customers that you do.
Yeah, and think about the quality assurance standpoint that you can afford if you are a community bank that serves your neighbors and people around you. You're going to have to be nicer to them because at the end of the day, they can TP your house. You're just naturally more prone to being nicer to people that you know more, right? The Bank of America, they have a completely centralized management style, right? So the people who write the rules of, how long the line can be are the people, sitting in the North Dakota headquarters of Bank of America. They don't care how many people are in line. They don't care if anyone's going to TP your house teller. So it's sort of, you have to be more personable if you're a smaller bank. But there's an economic argument as well. Yeah?
There's more resources though for the smaller bank. If he does consolidate with a bigger bank, and he has a bigger resource, he can get money from capital from, right? And that would be good for the smaller bank and for the smaller community also.
Yes, that's a good counter argument, I guess. So it's what we're pointing to is that it's not a cut and dry thing like consolidation is always bad or consolidation is always good. But one, in my opinion, compelling piece of evidence that I could present to you about why consolidation in banking might be a bad thing is the following, or I should say over-consolidation in banking. Consolidation in banking is definitely a good thing. The fact that we've been able to survive relatively unscathed when the number of banks in the United States reduced by half probably says that banks were operating a little too fat. They had a lot of room for cost-cutting measures. But one interesting statistic is that community banks represent less than 20% of total assets in this country. Community banks are the smallest ones, the ones in the little rural towns, and in sort of, I think, the Arvest banks, those would probably be regional banks, but just a tier smaller than them would be considered community banks. So anything less than 10 billion in assets is considered a community bank. Practically speaking, community banks typically have 300, 500 million in assets. But 20% of all the assets in the U.S. banking system are concentrated in community banks. In stark contrast, 60% of the small business lending that takes place in the U.S. banking system takes place at community banks. Community banks are positively specialists at small business lending. They have the resources, they have the know-how, they have the understanding of the community around them to discern a good small business loan from a bad one. Because that's a notoriously difficult decision. Because this is not something that you can have, these robo-lending kind of standards and say, okay, well, every guy that asks for this much money who has this high of a debt to income, we're going to give him the money. Doesn't matter whatever his business model is. This takes a lot of careful understanding of, his grandfather, left tons of debts. And you can only know that kind of stuff if you exist in the community. That's why community banks are much better, much more specialized at small business lending. And to the